My name is Leslie Ashmore. To the humanist community, I'm probably better known as Brian Davis's friend. I'd like to just mention briefly that my daughter Annie Ashmore is joining me in the audience today. She will be giving her own humanist presentation December 29th on the topic near and dear to her heart, charity nonprofit organization called Invisible Children. I'm just curious, have any of you ever heard of Invisible Children? A few people? Well, in a tiny nutshell, it's a group that works, among other things, to bring to justice a Ugandan warlord by the name of Joseph Kony, who has been abducting women and children into his army, the Lord's Revolutionary Army, LRA, and she'll be talking about that in December. So we're hoping that you can all attend. So now on to my main job this morning, which is a very brief introduction to our wonderful speaker, Nancy Unger, a woman who needs no introduction, and yet I will be giving you one. Nancy is a tenured professor at Santa Clara University. She teaches history, several very interesting courses that I would love to attend. She's a graduate of the University of Southern California. She's written countless book chapters, journal articles, and 2, soon to be 3, wonderful books. And I want to get the titles exactly right, so I'm going to read from my notes. Her first book, Fighting Bob La Follette, published in the year 2000, won the Wisconsin Historic Society Book of Merit Award in 2001, a wonderful book I enjoyed very much. Her second book, which came out last year, Beyond Nature's Housekeepers, American Women in Environmental History, a California Book Award finalist, and also the topic of her talk in January of this year at the Town Hall Seattle meeting in, obviously, Seattle. And if you Google this online, you can find it and watch it and enjoy it as I did this morning. So, without further ado, you'll enjoy and give a warm welcome to Nancy Unger.
Okay, I'm on. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and always thank you for coming today. I'm very excited to be here. It's always a joy to be with the humanist community. And again, thank you for letting me speak. I am really hoping that this talk is going to grow up to be my next book. It's just a baby now, but I'm hoping it'll grow up to be that. So I'm very interested in your responses today. When the Supreme Court took up the appeal of 2 men convicted in 1913 under the 1910 White Slave Traffic Act, it was reviewing some huge questions stemming from that legislation. What is the proper role of government? Can morality be legislated? Should it be? In a nation built on the separation of church and state, can extramarital sex between 2 consenting adults be a crime if it involves crossing state lines? At the turn of the last century, during the long Gilded Age and Progressive Era, the United States was experiencing a revolution in morals and manners. While drinking, gambling, and prostitution were by no means unknown, even in colonial America, as the nation transformed from a rural agrarian economy, opportunities for vice abounded in the mushrooming cities. Nightclubs, saloons, gambling parlors, brothels, dance halls, bars, cheap hotels, and opium dens were frequently clustered in discrete areas, like New York's Bowery and San Francisco's Barbary Coast. But such centers hardly could claim a monopoly on urban bad behavior. Middle-class girls and women previously courted in the parlors of their homes under the protective eye of family members found, along with their working-class sisters, plenty of opportunities to meet boys and men free from chaperones at amusement parks. Amusement parks were very grand, at these early ones, on streetcars, in shops, in cafes, even at work. New, less restrictive ways replaced the old rules of courtship at all levels of society. Henry Ford's Model T first rolled off the assembly line in 1908, giving rise to what was called the portable bedroom, affording private space to unmarried couples without the risks associated with checking into a hotel room. Prostitution was a particular concern, as much because of its impact on the paying customer as well as the prostitute herself. According to the purity campaigns of the previous century, the act of consorting with a prostitute left a man, quote, exceedingly depraved, rendering him incapable of those pure and exalted enjoyments which are found in connubial life where perfect chastity has been preserved. In 1913, a special performance of French writer Eugene Braux's play Damaged Goods was staged for President Woodrow Wilson, his cabinet, and both houses of Congress. This widely discussed play, quickly novelized by Upton Sinclair, further inflamed the public concerning the dangers of unsanctioned sex. It shockingly depicted the devastation that middle-class men inflicted upon themselves and their innocent wives and children when they brought home venereal disease contracted from the prostitute. The New York Times declared the play, quote, initiated a movement in this country which must be regarded as epoch-making. Polite society had long determined a woman's worth by her virtue and piety. They viewed prostitutes with a combination of disdain, pity, and horror. In a culture in which the simple loss of virginity marked the ruin of an unmarried woman, voluntary entry into prostitution was unthinkable. Although prostitutes were disparaged for their willingness to sell their sexual favors, most of even their harshest critics believed that such a choice was fueled by desperation rather than depravity. Others asserted that even poverty was no excuse for a woman to lose her virtue. In a 1913 article entitled, "Can a Working Girl Live on $8 a Week?" Sacramento Bee columnist Jane Cowell asserted that as little as $6 a week was a living wage for a properly frugal and virtuous young woman. The confidence that most Americans held in the natural purity of women, however, conflicted with equally strong beliefs about the general inferiority of certain racial and ethnic groups. Recent immigrants, poor African Americans, and most African Americans were poor, and other non-white women were deemed more susceptible to prostitution, although controversy raged over whether this was due to inherent moral weakness or economic necessity, or a combination of both. More worrisome for most Americans was the entry of white women, particularly older stock Anglo-Saxon Protestants, into the oldest profession. For a public that believed in the inherent purity and sexual passivity of women, their acceptance of prostitution could not be voluntary at all, but had to be the result of innocent young women like these, lured by falsehood and victimized by brute force. A front-page story in the Sacramento Bee, for example, reported, quote, "San Francisco finds a new tenderloin," subtitled "Sad Tales of White Slavery." Quote, "Many girls, scarcely more than children, are lured to their ruin through promises of respectable employment given in advertisements in rural newspapers." Now, scholars debate the degree of the white slavery problem at the turn of the last century. There were indeed genuine instances of sexual trafficking, but most scholars agree that its prevalence was exaggerated. They disagree over why. Some scholars claim that the alarmism over white slavery was part of a moral panic over urban vice in general. Others view it as a way of confirming and exploiting stereotypes, the evil foreigner and the virtuous yet vulnerable American female. The New York Times added credibility to the white slave crisis when it joined newspapers across the country in posting stories with headlines like, "4 white slaves sold for $160. You see this caption here, "Oh my God, if only I could get out of here." On April 30th, 1910, the New York Times announced declaratively on its front page, "White slave traffic shown to be real." Author Charlotte Perkins Gilman and reformer Jane Addams confirmed such assertions, warning of the new perils of this old condition as it pervaded modern urban America. Perhaps most persuasive of all were the speeches, the sermons, the addresses, the lectures by various politicians, ministers, missionaries, and professors, all eager to establish themselves as leaders in the crusade, not just to purify America, but the whole world. Confirmed instances of women being kidnapped in one country and sold into sexual slavery in another convinced many reformers that such cases were only the tip of a very large iceberg. In 1910, Ernest Bell, secretary of the Illinois Vigilance Association, edited "Fighting the Traffic in Young Girls," or "War on the White Slave Trade," a collection of essays, including several by Edwin Sims, United States District Attorney in Chicago. Although Sims never proved there was a vast white slave syndicate operating on the national or international level, his allegations hardly seemed outlandish or fabricated. The International Convention for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic had met in Paris for 10 days in July of 1902. Delegates representing 13 nations from 5 continents reconvened in 1910 to draw up a series of resolutions to suppress international trafficking in women. An agent of the U.S. Bureau who visited England, Belgium, Austria, France, Germany, Russia, and Romania confirmed reports from officials in those nations, quote, "There is no such thing as an international organization having for its object the exploitation of women." Nevertheless, the resolutions issued by the convention bolstered Sims' claims. His certainty was infectious. Sims' most influential adherent was Representative James Robert Mann, who served in the House of Representatives from 1897 to 1922. Mann contributed significantly to much of the legislation that shaped the progressive response to the Gilded Age. You've heard me talk about this before. Like most progressives, he believed that the new urban industrial society necessitated increased government. Urban dwellers who bought their food in markets rather than raising it themselves were entitled to guarantees by the government that it was accurately labeled, that their sausages were not filled with stretchers like sawdust, and their medicines were free from harmful ingredients like kerosene and turpentine. Farmers, newly dependent upon the railroads to transport their crops to market, should be protected by the government from having to pay all the market will bear prices. James Mann promoted legislation that became the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Mann Elkins Act, which empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroad rates. Mann enthusiastically supported government protection of the virtue of American womanhood because he believed that it too was facing unprecedented peril. Even young women who still lived with their families in the burgeoning cities could not always be directly supervised by their parents, and in their innocence might be lured into trusting an unscrupulous man, even in the seemingly most wholesome of places. In this drawing entitled "The First Step," featured in Fighting the Traffic in Young Girls, a virtuous young woman is seated next to a smiling, well-dressed man. The caption reads, "Ice cream parlors of the city and fruit stores combined, largely run by foreigners, are the places where scores of girls have taken their first step downward. Does her mother know the character of the place and the man she is with?" The White Slave Traffic Act, better known as the Mann Act in recognition of its sponsor, took aim at these villainous fiends. The Section 2 of the Act mandated, quote, "that any person who shall knowingly transport or cause to be transported or aid or assist in obtaining transportation in interstate or foreign commerce any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or any other immoral purpose shall be deemed guilty of a felony." Over the strenuous objections of a number of Democrats in Congress, they didn't say it was wrong to legislate morality. They said that it violated states' rights because it gave the federal government too much power. But it passed in 1910. Police never covered the international white slave syndicate described by Edward Sims, but over the years, they did use the Mann Act selectively to prosecute a variety of men. One of the first, and perhaps the best known, was the African-American heavyweight boxing champion, Jack Johnson. In 1912, Johnson was arrested for transporting across state lines for immoral purposes one Lucille Cameron, a white prostitute. The case fell apart when Cameron, soon to be Johnson's second wife, refused to cooperate with the investigators. Johnson was almost immediately arrested again, this time for violating the Mann Act with another white prostitute, Belle Schreiber. Although Johnson's relationship with Schreiber had ended prior to the passage of the Mann Act, an all-white jury convicted him in June of 1913. Johnson's conviction made it clear that the Mann Act could be used to prosecute uppity black men who consorted with white prostitutes. What remained to be seen was whether it could also be used to punish white men for committing adultery with women of the same race who were not prostitutes. The American Vigilance Association, a national organization created in 1912, claimed that measures like the Mann Act had led to a marked decrease in the white slave traffic and advocated a new kind of awareness. The executive committee, which included Jane Addams, as well as the head of Marshall Field and Company, Sears and Roebuck, and Quaker Oats, stated that one of the association's goals was to, quote, "make clear in the public mind that wiping out white slave traffic and the ills that accompany it, this is demanded by common sense and the necessity of conserving the public health and eliminating economic waste, aside from any questions of morality or religion." The association sought to, quote, "avoid the faddists and the sensationalists who have attempted to, at various times, exploit such matters for personal or fanatical reasons." Such a measured approach was no competition for the public certainty that white slavery was a growing menace to society. Popular entertainments presented the public with sensationalized depictions of the lurid stories prominently featured in the press. Bartley Campbell's racial melodrama, The White Slave, which had opened in New York City in 1882, played to enthusiastic new audiences during the years of the white slave hysteria. Mrs. S.M. Hagen, president of the Immigrant Girls' Home in New York City, helped whip the hysteria over white slavery to a fever pitch. Hagen believed that the increasingly popular motion pictures had the greatest chance of reaching the young women most in danger, recent immigrants who could not afford to attend plays like this and whose inability to read English rendered them beyond the reach of the warnings in newspapers and pamphlets. So Hagen approached screenwriter and producer Walter McNamara, who, happy to justify on the basis of moral reform a film on such a sensational topic, wrote Traffic in Souls, a film that was released in 1913. You can see it was quite a production. It announced that 50,000 women a year were stolen off streets and forced into prostitution. It was long at 88 minutes, and by contemporary standards, lavishly produced. You can watch it online on YouTube, the whole thing. It was filmed on location, partly on Ellis Island with actual immigrants in the background. It was a huge hit, spawning a spate of similarly themed imitators, some even more sensationalized than the original, with titles like The Lure, House of Bondage, The Little Girl Next Door, and Is Any Girl Safe? It was in this atmosphere of frenzied concern over the perceived epidemic of white slavery and panic over its ultimate results that two Sacramento couples boarded the Southern Pacific's number 10, formerly called the China Mail, on March 10, 1913, bound for Reno. Maury Diggs, 26, the married father of a 5-year-old daughter, had served as state architect, designing several large city buildings. He was nephew of California Democratic Senator Marshall Diggs and son of successful Berkeley contractor Irving P. Diggs. Farley Drew Caminetti, 27, is the married father of 2, including a baby 5 months old. He was a non-commissioned officer in the California National Guard, and until his recent resignation, clerk of the State Board of Control. He was the son of Anthony Caminetti, a former state senator recently appointed United States Commissioner General of Immigration by Woodrow Wilson. The two young men had for some months been spending considerable time with 2 unmarried women from prominent Sacramento families. Diggs was involved with Marcia Washington, age 20, and Caminetti with Lola Norris, age 19. Although the women had tried to keep their parents from knowing the truth, the couples had hardly been discreet. They had gone for long drives in Diggs' distinctive white Cadillac Torpedo, later referred to in the press as the Joy Machine. They had been frequenting bars and cafes and generally scandalizing the polite society of Sacramento. So why the four of them picked Reno as opposed to San Jose or San Francisco, where they had traveled previously, or Salt Lake or Los Angeles, destinations they also considered, boiled down to money. Maury Diggs wanted them to go to Salt Lake, but determined Reno would be cheaper. With the goal of leaving Sacramento just long enough for the gossip to die down, the couples hoped to slip out of town unnoticed. The train they boarded left the station at 12:50 a.m. Well, once their daughter's disappearance had been discovered, their infuriated fathers, T.H. Warrington, an agent of the Santa Fe Railroad, and retired businessman W.E. Norris, sprang into action. They demanded that criminal charges be filed against the men who had despoiled their daughters. Warrington even hired a private detective to help track the couples down. The episode shocked California's capital city, and the story of the illicit elopement was followed closely by the press throughout the state. Arrest warrants were cited for the two men for abandonment of their wives and for contributing to the dependency of their minor children. Warrants were also issued for the two women because they were under the age of 21 and therefore considered to be juvenile delinquents. On March 14th, the four were tracked down to a rented bungalow in Reno, placed under arrest, and returned to Sacramento. The women's families posted their bail and brought their daughters home. The charges against the women were eventually dropped. Diggs and Caminetti were jailed, where additional charges were filed against them, including violation of the Mann Act. The Mann Act's author clearly saw the Diggs-Caminetti case as kind of a referendum, not only on his legislation, but on the very soul of the nation. And the House Committee of the Judiciary investigated the way the case was being handled even before it went to trial. They talked about this case for days on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. In many hours of debate, Republicans strove to outdo each other in their moral outrage and demands that the fiends be brought to a swift and harsh judgment. Mann heaped sarcasm on Anthony Caminetti's request that District Attorney John McNabb postpone his son's trial so he could attend. Mann says, Caminetti was a youthful boy of 27 years, I believe with several children, and it was desirable to have his father at the trial to protect him in his guileless innocence, having only 7 lawyers to do so. Mann also spared no vitriol in his attack on U.S. Attorney General James McReynolds, who had acceded to the senior Caminetti's wish to delay the trial. McNabb proffered his resignation in a fit of righteous indignation over the delay, charging that the Department of Justice was, quote, yielding to influences which cripple and destroy the office of District Attorney. Mann extended his outrage to President Woodrow Wilson for accepting McNabb's resignation. Quote, frightened rabbits never got away quicker than the President and the Attorney General. The action now taken is pure hypocrisy. Manliness such as I would have expected from the Christian, moral gentleman occupying the White House would have required him to ask the district attorney to withdraw his resignation and try these cases. Mann had no monopoly or no monopoly on sarcasm or outrage. In a lengthy series of exchanges on the floor of the House, the case and all of its associated charges and countercharges was hotly debated. California Republican Julius Kahn declared, "The country demands the rigid enforcement of the white slave laws," expressing shock that the Attorney General of the United States did not know John McNabb, and hinting darkly that President Wilson and certain members of Congress were unpatriotic for not putting their full weight behind McNabb. In one of the greatest things I've ever read in the congressional record, Democratic Kenneth McKellar responded the views of many in his party when he said tartly to this sanctimoniousness, "My God, Mr. Speaker, what a charge to bring against the Attorney General of the United States. He did not know McNabb. McNabb, the great statesman. Why, no man in this House can be so ignorant that he does not know McNabb. McNabb, the great reformer. McNabb, the great publicist. McNabb, the great patriot. Why, the children in California cry out, 'We know McNabb.' The Hottentots in the far-off seas constantly ring with applause for McNabb. Why, they tell me the wild animals in Africa which were chased by Mr. Roosevelt some time ago all unite in praise and commendation, to use the words of the gentleman from California, of the great McNabb. The Attorney General of the United States is charged with the foul crime of not knowing McNabb. Well, I would like to know myself, who the blank is McNabb?" Democrat Joseph Burns was more direct in his charge that the holier-than-thou attitude of Mann and his supporters was primarily motivated by a desire to discredit the current administration. The gentleman from Illinois, meaning Mann, takes pride in the fact that he is the author of the White Slave Act, and he has a just and proper cause for doing so. It is a wise and most wholesome law. But the gentleman does not do credit to himself if he lends his great ability and power to a vain effort to make the American people believe that the President of the United States and the Attorney General are not sincerely anxious to see that law enforced to the fullest extent. Well, the two men were tried separately in San Francisco. Both trials were followed closely, not just in California, but throughout the nation, with the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times providing daily coverage. When two women's names were found to have been mistakenly placed on the list of potential jurors for the trial of Maury Diggs, roars of laughter erupted in the courtroom. The presiding judge, William Van Fleet, noted dryly, "Women jurors are not accepted in the court." After 2 weeks of testimony and only 5 hours of deliberation, Diggs was found guilty. His compatriot's trial was next. William Van Fleet again presided. During the jury selection process for the Caminetti trial, the judge made clear his interpretation of the White Slave Traffic Act, emphasizing that it was designed to criminalize immoral behavior. Quote, "There is no such thing as a personal liberty to commit crime, and the sooner people ascertain that fact, the better it will be for society." The judge also tried to persuade the women in the courtroom that the testimony about to be heard was unfit for their ears. To the disgust of this man dedicated to upholding female delicacy and decency, none of the women budged. Van Fleet's charge to the Caminetti jury was unambiguous, so much so that after the guilty verdict was rendered, juror W.A. Heister told the San Francisco Examiner, quote, "When we began to deliberate, the question was put to the jurors if there was a man among us who had not at some time done the exact same thing young Caminetti had done. This was debated up and down, but it was finally agreed by the majority that the jury could not do anything but convict based on the instructions given by Judge Van Fleet." Heister's comment generated considerable outrage, especially from Van Fleet himself, who threatened the juror with contempt, leading to a hasty retraction. All right. Before handing down sentence on Diggs and Caminetti, the judge made it clear that modern society shared a portion of the blame. Quote, "The evidence discloses very clearly that drink had its paralyzing hand upon your sleeping consciences during the period that you were debauching these girls, and society has, to a certain extent, to answer for that. The responsibility for the presence of the saloon, the dance hall, and the roadhouse, with all its debauching influences, rests, I think, upon society." According to the Sacramento Bee, for that reason, the men's punishment, quote, "will be a splendid thing for the moral atmosphere of California. It will put the fear of the law, if not of God, into the hearts of despicable wretches who make seduction of young girls their chief pastime." The San Francisco Call heartily agreed, running under the headline, "Leading Men and Women of City Endorse View of Federal Judge." Articles by a Baptist pastor, a customs official, a high school teacher, a women's club president, and the past president of the Juvenile Protection Association, all agreeing that moral corruption persistently is making for the ruin of the family and the disintegration of the race due to the general lack of public morals and of home training. Drew Caminetti was sentenced to 18 months and $1,500 fine. Maury Diggs drew 2 years and $2,000 fine. The two remained out on bail during the appeals process. Their convictions were the first to be handed down under the statute without any involvement of commercialized sex. Harper's Weekly editor Norman Hapgood denounced as idiotic the refusal to distinguish between organized interstate traffic and vice and the ordinary arrangements evident in the Diggs-Caminetti case. A Sacramento Bee editorial countered, "For what difference in guilt does it make whether a man does these things for profit or for lust? The inevitable result is the same, the recruiting for houses of prostitution." The logic of this inevitability was that once a young woman's virtue had been spoiled, she was unfit for marriage or legitimate employment. Turned out by her mortified parents, who had the honor of the remaining children to consider, she would resort for her survival to the only option available to her, prostitution. The Bee concluded that the law should not be reserved only for immorality that involved the crossing of state lines, but should be used to declare an all-out war on the revolution of morals, asserting, quote, "What is now an only interstate offense should be made a state crime by every state in the Union. Make adultery a criminal offense." The two convicted men admitted to the Circuit Court of Appeals that they had committed adultery with the two women, but argued that because they had no intention of prostituting them, the Mann Act had not been violated. The appellate court upheld their conviction, but did not squarely address that central question. Did sexual acts involving no coercion or payment fall under the purview of the Mann Act? The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. Marcia Warrington had miscarried shortly after Diggs's arrest. Although Diggs contested the divorce papers filed by his wife in 1914, the divorce was granted that September. On December 15, 1915, Diggs married Warrington, the woman who had testified him at the original trial. She stood by her husband while his case was argued with Caminetti's before the Supreme Court in 1916. New to the court was Louis D. Brandeis, whose confirmation less than 6 months earlier came after an unprecedented 4 months of bitter opposition, that Brandeis was both Jewish and a liberal activist alarmed conservatives. He deemed American law overly dependent upon precedents that no longer applied to the rapidly developing nation. He maintained that laws needed to keep pace with the times, and that lawyers and judges needed a modern knowledge of present-day problems to serve. Tensions surrounding his appointment were running so high that the Senate Judiciary Committee held for the first time a public hearing to allow the nominee's foes and supporters to give testimony. Lead lawyer for Diggs and Caminetti, Joseph Bailey, argued before Brandeis and the others that his clients had been convicted based on a misunderstanding of the law, which was intended to stop sexual trafficking, not adultery or extramarital sex. According to Bailey, the two men's convictions were therefore unconstitutional, based as they were in the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, which says, quote, that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several nations and with Indian tribes, period. It had long been agreed that the transportation of passengers in interstate commerce was within the regulatory power of Congress, and Congress had the authority to keep interstate commerce free from immoral uses. However, according to Bailey, quote, the White Slave Traffic Act is unconstitutional if extended to cases where no element of profit exists. All cases heretofore upholding the law have involved actual traffic of women for gain. The nature of the white slave traffic and the meaning of the terms are generally and judicially known. The court should take cognizance of the evil aimed at by the act. The Paris Agreement, the proclamation, the act itself and its title, White Slave Traffic, and the committee's report all demonstrate that commercial traffic alone was in view. Commerce in the Constitution implies traffic and gain. Congress cannot regulate morals and thus usurp the state police power by forbidding the mere passage or transportation of passengers. Bailey argued the very name of the law clearly revealed its intent. Quote, if Congress intended to include in this act cases of naked immorality without any element of commerce or coercion, then to call it the White Slave Traffic Act was a misnomer. And we can hardly assume that Congress would take the trouble to formally bestow a name on a statute and misname it. If the court were to uphold the prevailing understanding of the Mann Act, it would become not only the most, quote, the most drastic criminal law enacted by the American Congress, but an unconstitutional overreach by Congress, which cannot regulate the personal conduct of those who travel. And then one more quote from Bailey. Our humanity revolts at the thought of punishing a moral lapse as a felony, and no law which does so can be properly enforced. He said if his client's convictions were upheld, the results would be dire. Not only unconstitutional, but they're going to lead to what he called a form of national suicide. If the law means that all immorality connected in any way with interstate transportation is within this act, then it is designed to regulate morals, not Congress. And if the Congress of the United States can take the morals of the people under federal control, it can, under the same pretense, gradually usurp the police powers of these states and finally destroy the states themselves. Specifically, he warned that such a reading of the law armed blackmailers who could now threaten to report to the police any act of illicit sex if it involved transportation. Speaking for himself and others, including Brandeis, Justice Day delivered the majority of opinion. The court rejected Bailey's arguments one by one. Most importantly, it concluded, quote, while immoral purpose would be more culpable in morals and attributed to baser motives if accompanied by financial gain, such considerations do not prevent the lesser offense against morals of furnishing transportation in order that a woman may be debauched or that a mistress or a concubine will be carried out under the meaning of this law. The court was not swayed by the argument that the law's title made its intent clear. The highest court in the land ruled that Congress could not legislate morality within the individual states, but confirmed that Congress could make illegal any extramarital sex that involved crossing state lines. McKenna wrote the dissenting opinion. He said, the words any other immoral purpose is so broad that every form of vice, every form of conduct that is contrary to good order is now going to be pursuable. The minority report quoted James Mann himself when he was trying to get this law passed. He had said, James Mann had said in Congress, quote, the legislation is not intended as an aid to the states as an exercise in their police powers in the suppression or regulation of immorality in general. It does not attempt to regulate the practice of voluntary prostitution, but is only against the panderers and procurers who compel thousands of women and girls against their will. The dissenting judges then concluded it is vice as a business at which the law is directed. Using interstate commerce as a facility to procure or distribute its victims, look, everybody knows there's a difference between the occasional immoralities of men and women and that systematized and mercenary immorality epitomized in the state's graphic phrase, white slave traffic. Like Joseph Bailey's summation, Kenna's report ended with a warning. Although the court's minority was not quite as an alarmist as Bailey was, it nevertheless expressed its own predictions. There is a danger in extending a statute beyond its purpose. Blackmailers of both sexes have arisen, using the terrors of the construction now sanctioned by this court as a help, indeed the means for their brigandage. The result is grave and should give us pause. Representative of the U.S. District Attorney in New York concurred, calling the court's interpretation of the Mann Act, quote, a menace rather than a help to the public. Unless it is amended, I expect to see the already big army of blackmailers increase. Some prominent figures risked gaining reputations as libertines by adding their voices to the chorus of dismay. David Starr Jordan, Chancellor Emeritus of Stanford University, stated publicly, "My view of the Mann Act has always been that it was not designed to apply to cases like Diggs-Caminetti." Various church officials, however, lauded the court for its decision, claiming it makes it impossible for the true white slave offenders to escape the law's clutches by covering up evidence of money transactions. Concerned Americans heaved a collective sigh of relief. The court's decision was a reassuring indication that the revolution in morals would now be held in check. The results were therefore a huge disappointment. Blackmailers offering payoffs from rich men they observed crossing state lines with women not their wives turned out to be the least of the injustices generated by the Supreme Court. As legal scholar Lawrence Freeman notes, over the next several decades, cases were tried in the courts involving charges ranging from seduction and betrayal, casual romantic trips, serious relationships of people living together. From 1922 to 1937, busybodies, people with grudges, outraged husbands, wives, parents, and miscellaneous others alleged violations of the White Slave Traffic Act, contributing to 50,500 Mann Act cases investigated by the FBI. Hundreds of convictions were reached each year. Some, like the Diggs-Caminetti case, involved consensual extramarital sex and were used to punish a variety of behaviors. A study of women in federal prison from 1927 to 1937 found that about a quarter of the female Mann Act violators were simply unmarried women who dared to travel about with married men. Scandalized and angry wives sometimes blew the whistles on their husbands. African American men whose involvement with white women earned them convictions under the Mann Act include Rex Ingram in 1949 and the rock and roll star Chuck Berry in 1962. It proved a delightfully scandalous way to punish famous white men for their left-of-center politics or flouting of social norms. Charges of violation of the Mann Act were filed against sociologist William Thomas in 1918, architect Frank Lloyd Wright in 1926, British poet George Baker in 1940, and film legend Charlie Chaplain in 1944. Even those exonerated suffered profoundly from the scandal associated with the initial charges. The Mann Act was also used to persecute polygamous practices of the Mormons and to jail organized crime figures. Diggs-Caminetti entered Washington State's McNeil Island Penitentiary on April 3, 1917. The following day, the U.S. Senate voted 82-6 to declare war against Germany. The two convicted white slavers were quickly forgotten as the nation's attention shifted to the conflagration that now encompassed the globe. After serving a little over 6 months, Drew Caminetti moved to Oakland, where he became a contractor. He and his wife eventually divorced, big surprise. Maury Diggs served 8 months before resuming his career as an architect. He and Marcia Warrington raised a daughter and remained married for 40 years. Diggs returned to architecture, designing the Alameda Tunnel, Golden Gate Fields, the Hollywood Racetrack, and the remodel of Bay Meadows. He died in 1953, 8 years after Drew Caminetti. The Mann Act outlived both men whose crime Congress made a license to police American sexual immorality, as long as it crossed state lines. More than a century after their original trials, it remains on the books, but in a modified form. It was amended in 1986, and the ambiguous term debauchery and the problematic phrase any other immoral purpose have been replaced with, quote, any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a criminal offense. In 1917, the Supreme Court's decision failed to curb the revolution in morality rising out of the conditions of a new urbanized, industrialized America. The revised law is used today as an important tool in the war against sex trafficking, transportation for the purpose of prostitution or illegal sexual acts, including child pornography. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, any questions?
Hi, thanks, Nancy. I was just wondering, were the two men convicted because they were having sex with underage women? If the women had been over 21, would it have been okay? Or
if they'd stayed in Sacramento, it would have been okay. If they'd gone to San Jose, if they'd gone to San Francisco, it's that they crossed state lines. That was what did it. Even if the women had been over 21, they were still equally guilty of the crime. So, and it wouldn't have I mean, but the state line thing is the big deal. If you're going to have extramarital sex, don't cross state lines until 1986 in this country. Yeah.
Hi, I don't know if you can answer this question, but what do you feel America's morality, ethics mean? Porn basically drives the internet now, and certainly since the Playboy came out, the whole consciousness of this country has changed when it comes to sex, but yet the laws haven't quite kept up yet. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know. I really struggle with this because I believe in free speech. And, you know, I do, and I think a lot of stuff that I find, you know, porn offensive and so forth, but I believe in this. I do believe, though, that there are laws against child pornography, you know, all kinds of, you know, bestiality, you know, this kind of stuff. So I'm not particularly happy with it, but I feel that's the price I pay for living in a society that has free speech. So I struggle with this, with that particular issue, but that's where I come in on it. Yeah. Yes.
I believe the Mann Act also says just moving within the District of Columbia, they don't have to cross that line. So it could be that a man could take his girlfriend to a cocktail party and engage in the immoral act of drinking whiskey or something that might be prosecuted under the Mann Act. Is that a possibility?
I don't know about Washington, D.C., and at this point, it wasn't illegal to drink. We don't have prohibition yet.
But it would be, it's not illegal, but immoral.
Yeah, but it's immoral. That's the tricky word. Who gets to decide what is? I mean, that's kind of your question too. Who gets to decide what is immoral? And this put Congress in the position of saying, we do. Yeah, we get to decide, and we give the police that power to make that decision.
Many of the examples that you give of the people who were tried were social, political, and cultural elites. I was wondering how often convictions happened with sort of middle or lower classes.
Well, a lot more did. They didn't make the headlines. You know, I think I've got the statistics here somewhere of, you know, how many cases. I mean, hundreds were found guilty hundreds of people were found guilty every year, and I've seen a statistical breakdown, and most of them are just regular schmoes, you know, like us. It's the Charlie Chaplains that make the big headlines, but the majority were just regular people. But it was a great way, if you had an axe to grind against somebody, to go after them. Yeah.
I have a question, actually. I didn't hear anywhere in your talk where the actual wishes and will of the woman.
Doesn't make any difference.
It didn't come up.
It doesn't matter. No, it came up in their trial because they kept saying, well, but these women were willing, and the judge kept saying it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they were willing. None of that matters. The point is, women are to be protected, and men have this responsibility, and yet you'll notice that some women ended up doing time under the Mann Act as well. So yeah, it didn't matter that they went willingly. That they had violated this law.
I was wondering about the term white slavery. It always struck me as being blatantly racist.
Yes.
Is that term still used?
I don't think it's used anymore.
I mean, when did it disappear? I know I'd heard it as when I was young.
Yeah, well, it was at its apex at this time that I'm talking about in the teens. I think it was around really until the civil rights movement finally drew attention to to how racist
I was
it
thinking
was.
Maybe Xavier Hollander ended that.
Yeah, I don't know.
If this famous Greek movie, Never on Sunday, which is a 1960 movie, I guess most people know about it.
It had great music.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Well, if it had been made in the United States, I know now there would be no problem, but what year do you think, if it had been made in the United States, would have not created the courts going after the people that made it?
I didn't quite get the question.
Well, my question is, okay.
I just didn't hear it. Just repeat it. I didn't hear
Yes.
it.
If that movie had been made at the
During
time-
this time?
No, going back in years from
Okay.
now it would be no problem.
Right.
But going
No, I mean
back
back at the time I was talking about.
yes,
Yeah.
I would, all the movie makers, directors, and every actors would all have been put in jail.
Well, they weren't actually doing it, they were just depicting it. But that movie could not have been made in Hollywood at this time because that would have just been, you could have made that movie if it had a very like those movies that I showed that were all very sensational, but the point of the movie is you can't be celebrating this. If you're making a movie that's a morality tale, that's saying, see how terrible this is and how it hurts people, that movie could be made. But otherwise, no. You're debauching the morals of the public and so forth. So no, that would not be allowed. Yes.
I liked your statement about vulnerable people, and I think a lot of times these laws come out of that wanting to protect women, wanting to protect children, that kind of thing. And one incident I remember where the National Organization for Women almost split over this when I forget the name of the magazine publisher, but it was a picture of I think almost totally nude woman hung on a meat hook. And women, feminists particularly, were really outraged by that. And I remember feeling the same way. I just thought it was horrible that, I didn't mind pornography if it didn't get into this kind of brutality. But I realized, and then I came up against, I had to argue with other women about this, that freedom of speech, we have to let him do it.
Well, if you're going to live in a free society, there are a lot of risks that you have to take. And as I say, I am, there are forms of pornography that are illegal, but but this, it's not an easy question, I think, to address. There are a lot of things that I really find repugnant, but, that's what happens when you live in a free society.
I have never witnessed such an immoral Congress, the one we have now, and let's add the electoral process also, How is it conceivable that such a Congress is entitled to regulate our moral?
Well, this really is the question, because when I sent this essay to a friend of mine who's a law librarian, she said, well, you're putting all this on the Supreme Court, that they're confirming this. She says, Congress had to come up with this and approve it. I mean, this really is, it's a combination of Congress and Supreme Court happening. So, I'm sorry, now I lost the thread of your question. What was it?
Such a Congress regulates our morality.
Well, they felt that, look, we're in this unprecedented time, and we have lots more laws than we've ever had before, regulating pure food and drugs, and we've got immoral problems that they thought we'd never had before, so they really felt this was part of their job. And this is the reason I started writing this book, is, I'm interested in the progressives, and I wrote the biography of Robert La Follette. I've talked about him before. These are well-meaning people. They really feel that they're doing a good thing for the country, and sort of this big question, well, how much government is enough and how much is too much? I'm happy to have the Pure Food and Drug Act. I'm not so happy to have people just trying to legislate my morality. So I think that it was part of this whole well-intended piece. But as you're pointing out, there's a real sanctimoniousness. I know what's best for you. You know, we know what's best for the American public. And the fact that this stayed on the books until 1986 is really shocking to me. That, you know, this notion that for any immoral purpose, what does that mean? Who decides? Congress decided that they could decide. Yeah.
In the first part of your talk, you mentioned that Congress was influenced by the statement that the pimps were foreigners. At that time, there was a great hostility against foreigners. I remember my grandmother labeling a person a foreigner.
Yes.
I suggest you research that attitude at that time and see how it influenced how it influenced the passage of that legislation.
Yeah. Yeah, there was you're right, there's a tremendous sort of xenophobia going on. All of these immigrants were pouring into the United States. We'd had immigrants, obviously, we're a nation of immigrants, but these were huge numbers. Many of them were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We had Jews, we had Catholics, and a lot of them were unskilled people who were providing the labor for the new industries. But there was a great deal of fear and resentment. And so you'll notice in these slides, it's foreigners who are luring in the old stock American girls. I mean, it's a great way to scapegoat foreigners. And that was part of, I think, the popularity of this, and part of the reason that the white slave hysteria was so, I think, caught on so quickly. It was a great way to scapegoat foreigners, to reinforce that, well, why are white women becoming prostitutes? It can't be that virtuous women would actually choose that. It must be those foreigners who are luring them in. So it fed a lot of prevailing attitudes at the time. You know, fear about what was happening to American morals, fear of foreigners. It was kind of a perfect storm.
I think the baby was trying to tell us something. Lunch is ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.